The day I found a 70-foot cell tower sprouting out of my alfalfa field like some kind of metallic monolith, I was not angry. Not at first. I was blinking at the blinking red light on top like a man who's just been asked to explain a punchline he hadn't heard yet. Cows were circled around it, noses pointed like villagers staring at a UFO, and I stood there in pajama pants, coffee in one hand, feeling like I'd wandered into somebody else's fever dream. No permits, no letters, no calls, just steel cables and a smug little crew cheerfully drilling into my dirt. One guy waved and said, "You must be from the HOA. Great spot you picked." I blinked slowly, sipped my coffee, and thought, oh, hell no. Rewind 48 hours. My life was boring in the best possible way. 10 acres of inherited farmland on the fringe of a picture-perfect HOA suburb, beige houses, mandatory grass heights, passive-aggressive newsletters, and very loud lawn blowers on the weekend. I kept my field tidy, more out of love for my grandfather than any modern gardening fetish. The HOA left me alone, and I left them to their wine and cheese theatrics. That détente lasted until Karenette Cartwright got elected president. Imagine someone who thinks Martha Stewart is sloppy and strict. Rules are a public service. She wrote parking tickets on cocktail napkins and handed them out at barbecues. She once complained my weather-beaten wooden fence didn't fit the aesthetic, even though my property sat technically outside her jurisdiction. We had history, the kind that makes you paint your fence lime green just to watch a small tyrant twitch. So when I walked up to the on-site supervisor and he shoved a crumpled one-page community access agreement at me with my address on it and Karenette's name as landowner, I felt that slow, steady heat of something dangerous settling in my chest. The signature looked like it was scrawled by someone half asleep with a Sharpie dated the day before. "Permits filed," the supervisor said, and then, uncomfortable, "We were told it's part of the Greenbelt. My field is private," I said, word by word, like I was explaining that 2 + 2 = 4. He mumbled something about being just the crew and backed away when I smiled and said, "Or you could park your truck behind my tractor." They paused. Construction. I used to write lease contracts for corporate real estate before farming. I know the language, the loopholes, the way a piece of paper can change a person's life. I drove home, pulled out the deed my grandfather filed decades ago, county stamp parcel number, bold lines that said this land was mine, end of story. And then I drove to the HOA clubhouse where Karenette was mid-speech basking in a cluster of neighbors who thought forward thinking meant more Wi-Fi and fewer complaints. She gave me that sympathetic smile people use when they're about to tell you why you're wrong for existing. "It's for the community," she cooed. "Increases property values." She patted my shoulder like I was a schoolboy. I handed her the fake lease and the photograph of the tower. Her eyes flicked, she blinked, she did that small animal thing where someone's world briefly contracts. "Technically," she said, with all the condescension of a woman who had been practicing condescension for years, "it appears to be part of the Greenbelt." "Technically," I said, "you just signed a lease for land you do not own. I hope you like lawsuits." That night I texted an old friend, now a real estate litigator. He replied in under 5 minutes with one sentence: "Play dumb. Let them dig their own holes deeper, then bring in the big shovel." So I played dumb. I let the HOA parrot their PR about 5G harmony and community benefits while I quietly assembled evidence, the original property surveys, title transfers, easement agreements, and the golden ticket. A certified copy of the deed with GPS coordinates notarized years ago. I went to the county assessor, had them pull up GIS overlays, and walked out with a color-coded map stamped by the county. Exhibit A. Then I visited Trey, the telecom site lease coordinator, young guy, headset, corporate collapse in his eyes, and laid the binder on his desk. The color drained from his face in a series of little guilty nudges. "But we signed a lease with the HOA," he said, and I felt a strange pity for him, and the warm, satisfying knowledge that people who make mistakes because they trusted the wrong person still have to fix them. "The lease is void," I told him calmly. "You're trespassing. Let's renegotiate." And spoiler alert, my rates were higher. Turns out the telecom had already paid the HOA 2 years up front. On paper, the tower was $100,000 a year in rent. They were giddy about it. But when Trey's legal team did the math against the county records, they realized the signature didn't match. The notary was a phantom. and someone had served them a beautiful forged buffet of paperwork. They called me back fast. They wanted to meet. I signed the new lease, the money hit my account in 2 days, and I felt equal parts vindicated and ridiculous as I bought a new tractor and paid down my own boredom. But money wasn't the point. Not entirely. Power was. Karenette thought she could strong-arm a community and rewrote a chunk of public trust into her own ledger. She'd miscalculated. The more important thing was the reaction. I leaked the new lease terms to some well-connected, already irritated residents, and suddenly people wanted answers. Where did the original payment go? Why wasn't there a vote? Who signed on behalf of the HOA? Rumors flew, emergency meetings were called, and the HOA began to fracture like old plaster under a sledgehammer. Here's the twist. The telecoms complaint triggered a county investigation, and the notary listed on the original lease had their license revoked 12 years prior for notarizing Pete adoption forms without verifying identities. This was not just incompetence. It was criminal forgery. When I passed that file to the board, Roy, the vice president who had once yelled at a squirrel for being too loud, resigned the next day. The board imploded. People who had sat quietly through years of petty rules suddenly demanded transparency, an audit, an accounting, a reckoning, and when the community smelled blood in the water, they organized. We created what we called with grim humor the Book of Nope. 38 pages of violations, footnotes, cross-references. It was bureaucratic justice, and it was beautiful. Karenette filed a lawsuit against me. Of course, breach of easement, obstruction of development, emotional distress, as if my alfalfa had personally insulted her lipstick. She represented herself with a binder full of Google Earth screenshots and conspiracy framing. The judge, trying to keep a straight face, dismissed the case in under an hour and warned her not to file frivolous claims. She stepped down in a room that did not clap. The silence was sharper than any applause. She left without looking back and sold her house to a circus of a family with goats and a trampoline, which felt like poetic punctuation. While all this unfolded, I didn't only laugh and count checks, though. I won't pretend the checks didn't make a sweet sound. I also did something more useful. I filed a notice of correction with the county, fixed the registry, and put up a sign that read, "Big and underlined private property tower, operated with permission of actual owner." I installed a decorative gate, security cameras aimed politely at the HOA entrance, and solar uplighting that made the plaque glow like a tiny municipal confession. I even flew a drone during a secret board meeting legally near public property and captured footage of red faces and frantic folder throwing that I edited into a highlight reel and leaked to the neighborhood chat. People saw themselves reflected in the spectacle, and suddenly they were awake. The aftermath was a civic miracle disguised as petty revenge. HOA fees were slashed. The board was restructured with actual neighbors who cared about fairness, and the neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt like people, not passive-aggressive statutes. Folks brought pie to my porch, asked how to read bylaws, and told stories of being too intimidated to speak up before. That part hit me harder than the rent checks. For years, we'd all been surviving the small humiliations of a system that rewarded performative control. One well-placed tower broke the spell. I turned the tower into a small business and a symbol, Boundary Line Solutions. Know what's yours. Keep it yours. I began helping neighbors fight overreach review agreements and navigate land use wizards. I gave a few talks, answered emails, and watched as other communities found their voice. The tower checks kept coming smooth as butter, and I jokingly called that corner of the field the Signal Farm. A month later, an anonymous note arrived saying, "Congratulations on your tower, Nick P.S. I moved to Fairwinds Acres. New HOA, new start. No name, no apology." I chuckled, tipped my drink to the blinking light, and thought, some people never learn. If there's a moral, it's not the cartoon of karma's instantaneous justice. It's the practical, stubborn truth that documents matter, not because they're glamorous, but because they're the scaffolding of fairness. Facts, paperwork, a county stamp, patient persistence. These things win against performative power. There's a certain poetry in watching a bureaucracy implode under the weight of its own paperwork, I'll admit that. But what mattered most was discovering that the quiet majority wasn't quiet because they agreed. They were quiet because no one asked or because they thought speaking up was pointless. It took one man's refusal to be polite about theft to make a neighborhood realize it could be something else. So yes, I got paid. My tractor has new tires and my field is greener. We threw a barbecue. Towers and triumph and kids ran around under the gently blinking light as neighbors laughed together, unsolicited and beautiful. People who used to whisper at HOA meetings now brought clipboards. Dale, the retired contractor, told me I could probably charge rent for the view. Trey called about a 6G pilot. I started a small consulting side hustle. Life bent back toward ordinary in the best way, quieter, fairer, less governed by someone else's appetite for control. But here's the thing I want you to chew on. When a single person decides to say no to petty power and backs that no with facts and patience, it doesn't just fix one wrong, it cracks open a space for others to follow. That's the ugly, lovely truth. Do you think communities should have the right to quietly reassign other people's land in the name of progress? Or should we require real votes, real transparency, and real signatures from real owners? Tell me what you think is my brand of petty justice. Admirable necessary, or a little too fun? Drop your experience below, share a time. You took a stand, and let's trade notes on how to keep what's ours.